Hello everyone, I'm Professor Ozan Örmeci from Üsküdar University. Today we have a very valuable guest from United States. Mark Meirowitz is a professor at SUNY Maritime College in New York. Mark, welcome back.
Thank you very much, Professor Ormanji. It's my
Thank you.
pleasure and privilege.
It's our privilege. Thank you, Mark. You are an expert on Turkish politics and sometimes Turkish media channels, including state TV channel TRT and other institutions. Adhere to your expertise, and we also, as our privilege, United Uluslararası Politika Akademisi, we have you in some of our, episodes. So, Mark, first of all, as a New Yorker, congratulations. You have a, by the way, congratulations for Thanksgiving and the approaching Christmas also. I
Thank
mean,
you. You too.
so we, of course, we wish joyful Christmas to all our Christian friends as a Jewish and Muslim scholar. So, Mark,
Of course.
New York City Mayor Zohran Mamdani's election as New York City mayor created much media attention, and especially Mr. Mamdani's criticism towards Israeli policies, although he was a mayoral candidate, created some sensation. So, do you think, as a New Yorker and maybe part of American Jewish community also, do you think Mr. Mamdani is a threat to American democracy? Or, I mean, was it just an exaggeration? What are your observations and perceptions? Thank you.
Well, I mean, my thoughts are hopeful for a successful mayoralty, as the president did in the Oval Office. I think there's one difference between when you're campaigning and
Yes.
trying to get elected, and when you're elected and you're actually required to take care of the New Yorkers and do the job, which is probably, if not the hardest job in the world, but maybe very difficult. It's one of the largest cities in the world. They do say that being mayor of New York is the second hardest job in America, next to the presidency.
Mm.
So that's a fact. So I think that a lot of things have happened since the election, and I think that the mayor hopefully will be able to unite New Yorkers. But I think that his plans for socialism in New York remain to be seen whether they can be successful. We know very well that socialism does exist around the world, and it's very often unsuccessful because it comes along with raising taxes. And when you raise taxes in a city like New York, you end up with people who are high bracket, high earners leaving the city. And that's not good for the city. So I think that we need to have a leap of faith and remain to be seen what will occur. However, the rhetoric of the campaign and the rhetoric that has existed, I think, does need to be toned down. And so that all New Yorkers, and this is the mayor's pledge that he cares about all New Yorkers. So we'll have to see, as we say, the proof is in the pudding. The election was very, very fraught, and there's still a lot of dissension and discussion here in the city. So we are waiting with anticipation, and I think the president's approach was very pragmatic. He didn't end up having a discussion with him like he had with Zelensky. He had a good meeting with him, and I think he's willing to support him. But the mayor has to also work with the president too.
Sure, sure. Thank you, Mark. I got the answer. It's perfectly well understood. And Mark, of course, our main focus today and in our previous meetings was, of course, always Turkish-American relations, since we
Yes.
both study on this topic. And recently, our followers will, of course, remember it. In late September, President Erdogan made a historic visit to the United States after some long term, because he didn't have any chance to visit US during the Biden presidency. So he visited White House, and he was hosted by President Trump and his team at the Oval Office. There was this recorded session which went quite well, I think, on both sides.
Yes.
And we know that some agreements were made. I'm just summarizing to you to further elaborate. Turkey will import LNG from the US. Turkish Airlines will buy some Boeing planes from the US. the theological school of Halki in Heybeliada Turkish president will try to solve this issue. He said this to US president, and there might be potential agreements for defense industry. So the reflections of this visit in the American media, and as an expert, your observations, do you think we can talk about a new term in Turkish-American relations?
Well, I'm going to quote Ambassador Tom Barrack, who is the ambassador to Turkey, and he said that there's a bromance between President Trump and President Erdogan. And look, I mean, good Turkish-US relations are very, very important for both countries. Turkey is a major, mediator in Ukraine. It has many, many influences with Russia, with Ukraine. It actually is, multitasking in a way that nobody can. And certainly in the Middle East, I'm sure we'll talk about it. I think the points that you didn't bring up, which are the imponderable points, are number one, and certainly the idea, this kind of sounds like, let's make a deal with Trump, Turkey's going to LNG and Turkish Airlines and defense partnership, all of that's fine. But the open points, I think, were the question about the F-35s and the F-16s. Haven't seen that yet resolved.
Yes.
And certainly the situation in Syria, which we can talk about some more, and how that is going to be resolved, going forward in terms of the Syrian regime. This is extremely pivotal to US policy in the Middle East, I believe. And the situation right now is very uncertain in terms of the divisions inside Syria, in particular, the relation between Syrian government and the SDF, and of course the peace plan with the PKK in Turkey. All of these things are very, very important. But in terms of the relationship, and the meeting was very good. Good optics, good discussion, and certainly President Erdogan, I'm sure, went away very satisfied with the meeting, but with the exception that Trump himself said at the meeting. If you remember, he first said to the press, they asked him, what about the F-35s? He says, I'll let you know. But there was no answer on that. And then Turkey went and did a deal now on the Eurofighters and got permission from the coalition or the consortium in the four countries to permit that. So to me, that Eurofighter deal looks to me like a side deal to try to avoid the issue of what happens if the United States does not provide the F-35s and F-16s, because that requires congressional approval.
Yes.
So I think that on the presidential level, the relationship is very good. But I think that historically, of course, Biden did not invite President Erdogan at all. That was very, I think that was whatever. We can see it. In the law, we say the thing speaks for itself, and Trump did make that overture. But the other part of this story, which is Congress, if you recall, relations with Obama and other presidents, between the presidents, President Erdogan always was pretty good, with the exception of Biden. But the question always was Congress, and how does Congress stand with respect to its views of Turkey? And that is one that is still problematic, because Senator Jim Risch of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee said in the hearing when Tom Barrack was being nominated for ambassador, you'll recall he said, there's so long as I'm Senate Foreign Relations Committee chair, Turkey will never get the F-35s. So there is that issue. It's a tricky issue, also because Trump is negotiating a lot of big things with Congress. And the question is, how much political capital is he going to put in to boost this deal? And is there any pushback on this? And I would say, too, Professor Ormagi, that you note that the Saudis have gotten F-35s.
Yes.
I think we need to pay close attention to that. Is the United States going to give Saudis F-35s and Turkey F-35s when Turkey still has the F-400s? And so that was a very tricky issue between US and Turkey. And I also pivot to Syria. We can talk about that too, because all of these things are interconnected, because they deal with the perception of Turkey, particularly in the US Congress. and how Turkey is perceived. The deal on the Halki Seminary is great. And of course, the Pope visiting Turkey and
Yes, thank
meeting with
you
the
for mentioning
Patriarch
this.
obviously certainly smooths, I think, some of the ruffled feathers with the relationships between the Greek Orthodox Church and other churches in Turkey. So there are a lot of moving parts here. And clearly, one can be, I think, optimistic about the future Turkish-US relation, which is, I think, very, very important to both countries.
Thank you, Mark. And to follow up question, Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan also, following President Erdogan, he
Yes,
visited United States in an
yes,
unexpected move in November. I mean, the visit was expected, but he attended meetings with Syrian President Ahmed El-Shara, the new Syrian president,
yes,
with
yes,
President Trump himself, Foreign Secretary Marco Rubio, and many other important American statesmen. And the focus of these visit was, I think, the Syria issue, the Syrian
yes,
problem. What will happen in the Syria between Turkey, US, and Israel? The situation of Kurdish groups, plus the ceasefire agreement in Gaza, and what will happen in the future of Palestine, as well as Russia-Ukraine war, of course. So, what were your observations and thoughts about Fidan's visit following President Erdogan? Was it a complimentary visit to President Erdogan so that details became more precise and maybe a new era of cooperation began, or still very unclear? What do you think?
Well, I don't know. It's still, I mean, I wasn't there, so I don't know. So you and I, as analysts and experts,
Yes.
just can ruminate and figure it out. It would seem to me that Fidan is, a very astute and accomplished diplomat, even though his background is in intelligence. And by the way, that's an important asset, I think, in terms of the situation in the Middle East right now, particularly with Syria and Israel and the deconflicting of that situation, also with Turkey, is important to have somebody like Fidan there, who's had a long-standing understanding and relationships in this region. I think that number one, when you talk about the Syria situation there, that is a very tricky and complex situation, which at the present time, as we speak here today, is imponderable. It's not solved. It's very problematic. And, I mean, look, the diplomacy on this issue has been guided by Tom Barrack, Ambassador Barrack, not so much by the State Department, so that you have to listen a lot to Barrack and what he's thinking. And what he's thinking, I don't know whether is workable in terms of creating the future of Syria and who is going to motivate that future. How is that future going to be motivated? What you basically have is a fractured state. Just
Yes.
because al-Shara came in with his HTS and took over part of the country did not mean that he was able to actually facilitate control of the country or create a central, fully stabilized government. Yeah, there's something called, we study this in political science, nation building and state building. Well,
Yes.
Syria has a long way to go. Look, you can make a committee for a constitution. You can build up a parliament, but it doesn't mean that we call that in American history, the question always was the Constitution a parchment barrier? In other words, the paper it's written on, is it really indicative of the structure and how it's going to work? I question that in Syria because if you look at the Constitutional Committee, if you look at the parliament, I don't believe it's fully inclusive. And I think the United States has insisted that its government has to be inclusive, meaning of all the minorities. And that issue, and particularly the SDF and remaining a cohesive group, is an issue of high concern to Turkey.
Yes.
And the question is Syria going to be a federation or is it going to be a united state? Well, if you're going to have, and I think this is not anyone's secret, the secret massacres of Druze and Alawites and Christians, then you're not in the direction of forming a stable state. Now,
Yes.
Turkey's interest has many interests. It wants a stable Syria, clearly. And I think also because it wants to resolve the Syrian refugee issue, because the 3+ million, I don't know what the number is of the refugees of Syrians coming to Turkey. and they want to go home, I think. And so Turkey says you should go home, but you can't go home to a war zone. And that's why I think Turkey wants to have a stabilized Syria with a central government, with a go-to government, with a go-to president. And al-Shara has shown himself to be astute, astute. I mean, there he was in the Oval Office with President Trump, who is saying, "This is a young guy. He's a great guy." I mean, when you look at it, when you think about it, you think, is this for real? But yeah, that's Trump's diplomacy. And I think al-Shara, I would say, I would liken him to a juggler somewhere in the circus where he's juggling Turkey's influence, the influence of the Arab states in particular, who are very important to him in terms of funding,
Yes.
and of course, Israel and the minorities, and Israel occupying the Golan Heights and also occupying additional buffer zone. These are the realities of what Syria is today. Of course, Syria today is much better situation, I think, Aramizda and even in between us, than in Assad. No question, we're making a better world for Syria. But the Syrian world that we're making cannot be a one where minorities live in fear and minorities are persecuted. That the United States is not going to buy into. So I think the moves on the chess set look pretty good, but there have to be a number of fixes. I mean, if you say, as an American, and you say no elections for 5 years, and here's a committee, and let's put it together, and the committee doesn't have really women on it, doesn't have minorities on it, the parliament is structured in a way which is not, it's a parliament, but it isn't really functioning as a check and a balance, at least in the American mind, then there's a question. Of course, on the other side, you have Tom Barrack, who is pushing very hard for Syrian stability and for Turkey being a major player in Syria. So there's a lot of moving parts. So I would say remains to be seen, but
Yes.
hopefully and particularly there has to be deconflicting between Israel and Syria and Israel and Turkey in the sense that we cannot permit Syria to become a war zone again
Yes.
among the neighboring nations. That's a cataclysm, and that's bad for the Syrian people. The Syrian
Yes.
people are entitled to live in peace, and they're
Yes.
not
So
going to live in peace, and that is, until an al-Shara can show his leadership, and it's going to be hard for him because he has a lot of influencers who are influencing him and funding him.
yes.
So my answer to your question, as long as it is I would say I have is an open question, but one we are hopeful can be resolved in the interest of the Syrian people, clearly. And of course, the neighbors, and not to have another war in the Middle East, which,
Okay.
which is certainly possible, no question.
So maybe we can conclude that at least we know that diplomatic channels are open between two countries. President
Clearly,
Erdogan visited, Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan visited US recently. So diplomatic channels, and it's on the table. Syria issue, Gaza issue, probably Russia issue. They all discuss. They continue to discuss. So we can be maybe optimistic. At least we can be sure that there might not be another crisis. So Mark, you mentioned several times, and he has become widely publicized recently in Turkey. His Excellency Tom Barak is the both special envoy to Syria and also ambassador to Ankara, to Turkey.
yes.
He's a very different diplomat, so he's not coming from a professional diplomatic background, but he's been making a lot of poetic speeches. So he mentions different concepts, artistic concepts. So it's really interesting to listen to him. So he recently said in a meeting in Bahrain, I think, that from Hazar to Mediterranean, we will see a new American line is building. And he also mentioned that Turkey and Israel will cooperate, they will not fight. Um, in Turkish media and critics, there have been criticism towards him, but at the same time, it shows that he has maybe a plan for this. So, what we should understand from Hazard to Mediterranean, a new partnership will born.
The first thing to understand about Tom Barrack is that he's a close friend of the president. And
Yes,
that is the most important thing to keep in mind. In other words, It's not the State Department that's making statements. It's not the Secretary of State who's talking about an American line, American influence. It's Tom Barrack, President Trump's business friend. Okay. Now, this is enormously important. You have Steve Witkoff,
Yes.
Howard Lutnick, Tom Barrack. These are the people who have the ear of the president. This should not be gainsaid. It should not be diminished. It's extremely, extremely important. What Tom Barrack has to say about anything has to be taken with a grain of salt. He does not make the diplomacy. And President Trump is only in office until the next election. And I would add, if the midterm elections are coming up in our country for the Congress, if a house of the Congress falls to the Democrats, that's the end of President Trump's legacy, in effect, because he won't be able to be in control of the whole government, all the houses of Congress and presidency. So the question, I think, most importantly, is what is American foreign policy to the Middle East? Is America, and this is always the question about Trump, is Trump an interventionist, an internationalist, an isolationist? What is Trump? Okay. So I think a lot of what Trump does is transactional.
Yes.
And so therefore, it isn't sort of like if there's a Trump doctrine, it means like going from one thing to the other. Yesterday, he did Rwanda and the Congo. The day before, they were having meetings on Ukraine. Tomorrow, they'll have a meeting on something else. Probably he said something about Taiwan. So, the Middle East has always been a source of difficulty for the United States. It's always been a source of problems for the United States. So the idea that the United States wants to create a new policy for the Middle East, for this region, I think is very questionable. And who's the architect of that? Who's thinking about that? Is it Trump who's thinking about it? I don't think so, because he wants to put out fires. He wants everything to stabilize the situation. Does he have a wider view? Does he have a strategic view? I'm not sure, because again, he came up with this Gaza rehabilitation plan. Okay, that's sitting there. He has peace talks with Ukraine. He sends Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff for those meetings. Very important, very important. Trump is he's sort of like, we have like a commercial for a battery called the Energizer Bunny. It's like a robot, like a battery that keeps working. He works all day long. And I think in a very positive way, very
Yes,
positive,
absolutely.
tries very hard to bring peace. And I think he really means it. But the Middle East has been a very big stumbling block for the United States. So the approach there is more stabilization than, I think, a kind of a more comprehensive view of how you solve, is what you talked about, Barrack's view. And Barrack, I'm not so sure that all the elements of his view are productive or accurate. I think he means well. He comes from a particular perspective. He has background in the Middle East, which is great. Many times our ambassadors have no idea where they're coming or where they're going to. But the point is, can he make this kind of pronouncement that there's going to be an American line? I think if you want to understand the Middle East, look to Saudi Arabia. Look to the relationship Trump has with Saudi Arabia. That's the development that Trump is pushing, that development, giving them F-35s. But is he trying to put out all these or solve all these other problems? I just don't know in short range in terms of American politics, where we're talking about 2-3 years, whether you can have a comprehensive solution to these problems. I mean, I'll remain an optimist that peace should flourish, but peace in the Middle East has eluded us all through history. And whether Trump can come along transactionally and fix it. He couldn't fix Ukraine. I hope he can fix that one. Maybe he can. I hope so. Okay. Then in terms of all these other problems, transactionally moving from one to the other. And I don't know that Barrack is the one that can frame that solution, because And again, I come back to Syria because the Syria problem is to me so fundamental. Of course, Gaza as well. But these are the pressing problems. Are there solutions that are going to work? And that's what I think they should focus on rather than creating like a theory, a new concept for what's going to be flourishing in the Middle East. So many different moving pieces here in the Middle East. So I say I question it. Barrack is certainly, he's an ambassador. So whether he's in a position to frame a new direction for American foreign policy, I'm not so sure. I know he means well and has the ear of the president.
I try to be objective. Of course, I'm not a traditional
Please,
supporter of President Trump, but let me just explain one
please.
thing, Mark, to your attention. For instance, before President Trump got elected, there was still a civil war going on in Syria. Now there's a clear winner, and hopefully there'll be a transition process in Syria.
Yes.
There was a bloody massacre going on in Gaza. Now it's ended with a ceasefire. It didn't start in Trump. It started in the previous era. So, and he has his efforts to stop the war in Russia, Ukraine, in Ukraine. Turkey also, Turkish president also tries to help. So, I
Yes.
mean, looking objectively, I think he has done something very successful with the help of Steve Witkoff, as you know, Marco Rubio, J.D. Vance, and maybe also, of course, Tom Barak. So maybe it doesn't seem like maybe he doesn't have a deep and strategic understanding of things. Maybe he has insights about the nature of power, and it applies to also Mr. Tom Barak. He knows the political elite of especially Gulf countries, and they have the financial power. They have the power. So let's be optimistic, I would say. But of course, you are much more expertise compared to me on these issues.
Well, I would question that. I would defer always to your expertise. And I think your optimism is certainly well taken in terms of Barrack. He's very, very astute and very capable diplomat,
Yes.
of course. And he's trying very hard to frame some ideas for how to solve these problems, which is also very, very important. But in the structural point of view, this idea of his relationship with the president and the State Department not being in the mix. I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but I don't know how far he can go in terms of framing that structure going forward. Yes, I do agree with him. His heart is in the right place. He wants to create a stable Syria. I think that's what he wants to do. And I think that is a good objective. But you can only do that if all of the people playing the chess game are going to get together and work along with that idea, which I'm not so sure is what's exactly happening. Because if you look at Syria today, it looks very fractured to me. It looks like a fractured state, like a failed state. And Syria's al-Shara, yes, he's pragmatic and he's a great guy and Trump likes him and all that, but the follow through and how this plays out in terms of also who will fight ISIS, is it the Syrian regime? Is it the SDF? Will there be a buffer zone for Israel beyond the Golan Heights? Will there be a defense agreement between Turkey and Israel? All these questions are profoundly important questions, and I'm not so sure that it's Barrack who solves them and resolves them, if you see my point. Okay, the Trump, I agree with you. Trump is a positive, very, very contributing mightily to all these things, going and dealing with these issues. Tremendous achievements in his second term, no doubt about it. But carrying it through to fruition, that's the problem, and that's a structural problem for American politics as
Sure,
well,
sure.
because the president's worried about the government shutting down, and he's
Yes.
getting criticized all the time. And we have a left-right fracture in this country that is polarized, tremendously polarized in this country, against progressives, against Republicans, conservatives. So all of that is floating around here, and it's part of the soup of the chorba, if I may, in American politics that you can't ignore, because Tip O'Neill, you remember, Speaker of the House, I always say my favorite Turkish politician, but in any event, he said all politics is local. And
Yes.
so Trump understands that. This is why he has Mamdani as the first thing you read, right? Mamdani at the White House. He does
Yeah.
all that too. He sends National Guard into cities. He's also doing that. He's multitasking. So yes, I understand what he's doing, where he's sending out Witkoff and Barrack and all these guys out to go do these things. And the question is, can it be implemented structurally going forward to, so to speak, to use the art of the deal, to seal the deal? And as I said before, the Middle East has proved, and certainly Ukraine is a thorny issue with Russia, no question. But the Middle East has always been a thorn in America's side, and we've never been able to fully solve it in all these years. So, but I say kudos to President Trump for trying. There's no question. And I'm sure there will be positive accomplishments together with the regional neighbors. And again, we didn't talk about the Abraham Accords, but that is Trump's idea of how to bring peace in the Middle East.
Yes.
And that's very, very important as well.
And potential Saudi involvement to it.
Exactly. Yeah. Saudi is key, I think, in Trump's thinking. Saudi Arabia is the linchpin to our Middle East policy, no question.
Thank you, Mark. Maybe one last question, and maybe you can answer in a short way. Of course, it's difficult, I know, but we're keen on your expertise. So you drew us a picture in Syria, and we have local forces, President Shara, Turkey on the north, Israel on the south. So this picture, doesn't it necessitate for us, for stability, Turkish-Israeli cooperation, at least to some degree?
Look, let's be candid about it. We've had better times. There's a song, those were the days, my friend. There were wonderful halcyon days between Turkey and Israel. Absolutely. Having spoken Turkish diplomats, Israeli diplomats of that period, all along, very good relations. And I am going to be optimistic this will happen again. I am very, very sad to see the state of these relations. Also, the rhetoric between the countries is very, very disturbing and upsetting. And we don't need to be there. I think that, going back to a lunch I had in Istanbul with a Turkish businessman, and he said a very interesting thing. He said to me, Israeli business, Turkish business, we have the same. We like the same food. We're in the same region. We have so much in common. And so I'm going to emphasize that commonality in sense that, and remember in those great halcyon days, the Turkish Airlines was the biggest airline for Israelis and was competing with El Al. El Al was upset that Turkish Airlines, having been on Turkish Airlines, their hospitality and service is beyond. I mean, I remember I had a meal and I don't know what it was. And they said to me, oh, you don't like it? The chef will make you something else. I mean, where else? And this, I wasn't even in first class. And it's just what they were very disappointed that whatever it was, I don't know what it was, but they wanted to be, so hospitable. And this is the thing that I think will carry us through, which is we're in the region together, Turkey and Israel. We need to work together towards a peaceful future. I know I'm going to sound like a foolish optimist, but I must say that I think that those days could come again. But the way they come again is to tone down this rhetoric between the countries, which is very, very disturbing, and you can't get by it. You can't get past it to have any kind of a concrete discussion. I mean, the facts are, and I think if we don't remember, we political guys remember history, we historians. Before October 7th, Israel and Turkey, we had President Herzog, we had all kinds of overtures. We're going to do energy deals, which would be great for Turkey to do an energy deal with Israel. It would sort of give Turkey a one-up in terms of the EastMed partnership, which is a raid against Turkey and so forth. All these benefits could be achieved, and we're working in that direction. But again, and this might be for our next discussion, what was the result of October 7th? And that obviously created a whole
Disastrous.
new set of
Yes.
facts and very, very fraught, very disturbing, very problematic, where we're
Unfortunately.
even talking about Turkey and Israel and deconflicting and this. I just sit here and I'm just amazed and disappointed and dismayed at where we are in this situation. These are the two regional powers that are standing up, are doing things that are constructive. They need to work together. So, and I think that's in the basis of the United States to be able to make that be the matchmaker again to make
Yes.
that happen. I know maybe this sounds um, foolishly optimistic, but I'm not going to be pessimistic about it. But I think that the rhetoric needs to, relax itself and tone down so that we can actually have discussions. You can disagree with someone, but when the rhetoric becomes so destructive, then there's no time for anybody to sit and think about anything. Then everybody shuts down and they don't want to talk to each other.
I
That's
fully agree with you, Mark, and I think the key to this path is to both for Turkish-Israeli and Saudi-Israeli normalization
right.
is the establishment of a Palestinian state in Gaza and West Bank. From my point of view, of course, I'm not a Middle East expert, but I think this will open the door for Israel again in the Muslim world for many countries. It has already opened doors in many countries, but it will, I think, make Turkish-Israeli alliance permanent and it will lead to Saudi recognition of Israel, including many other Muslim states. So let's hope that Israeli decision makers also will realize this. So thank you so much for this interview, Mark. Hopefully next time we'll discuss about new things, new visits, and new progress. Thank you.
It's a pleasure and a privilege, and I say Garushmek Uzera, and all the best, and Kolai Gelson, and all the best to you and success. And thank you very much for the tremendous honor and privilege of doing this with you. It's really quite special, and I loved every minute. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Bye.